President Trump has said the United States is in mourning after an American Airlines flight and a military helicopter crashed over Washington, D.C. Mr. Trump said that no one had survived the tragic accident, which killed 67 people. 64 were on board the American Airlines jet, 3 on board the US Army helicopter. Well, this is what we know so far about events leading up to the fatal crash. The passenger jet, American Airlines Flight 5342, had been flying from Wichita in Kansas, heading for the American capital. Well, at just before 9 p.m. local time, in clear conditions, it was on its final approach into Ronald Reagan National Airport, flying through some of the world's busiest airspace, routinely used by both civilian and military aircraft. At the same time, a US Army Black Hawk helicopter, its route shown here in red, was approaching from the north. As the passenger jet was about to land, the collision occurred. Several videos, including the one you can see here, captured that moment. Well, let's go live now to Washington, D.C. and join my colleague Katrina Perry, who is at the airport with the very latest.
Thanks, Virginie. Yes, well, flights began here about 3 hours ago, began to land and take off again. There was a massive ground stop following the crash last night, and this is one of the busiest airports in the United States. About 800 flights take off and land each day. That business has resumed, although it is much quieter as some airlines have cancelled some flights for today or rerouted them to another nearby airport. In the Potomac River here behind me, which is just adjacent to the runway, that recovery effort is ongoing, and indeed further downstream as well. One of the things about the Potomac is that it has very heavy undercurrent, so the search area has been widened to include a large stretch of the river. Many agencies involved in trying to recover all of those individuals who have lost their lives, because that was one thing that President Trump did confirm at that news conference this morning, that all of the lives had been lost. And rescue teams have really been facing an incredibly difficult task. Of course, the first hours were in darkness, in very cold temperatures, freezing water temperatures as well. And here's our first report now from our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
In the freezing cold Potomac River, emergency services spent the night desperately looking for survivors. The wreckage of American Airlines Flight 5342 is in 3 separate pieces in the water. There were 60 passengers and 4 crew on board, 3 soldiers in the Army helicopter that collided with it. The bodies of at least 30 people killed in the accident have been recovered so far. CCTV pictures show the moment of impact. Very low in the sky over Washington, D.C., the helicopter and the plane are rapidly heading towards each other, and then we can see the sudden explosion. On closer footage, we can see the crash quite clearly. By morning, it was obvious that no one had survived the crash.
Despite all those efforts, we are now at a point where we are switching from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident, and we have recovered 27 people from the plane and 1 from the helicopter.
There are recordings from air traffic control as the accident happened.
Crash, crash, crash. This is alert 3. Crash, crash, crash.
Fire command. The accident happened in the river. The helicopter and the plane crashed in the river.
An investigation is already underway into how this accident could have occurred on a clear night when both aircraft were following standard flight patterns. Military helicopters do fly over and around Washington all the time. This Black Hawk was on a nighttime training flight. And we know air traffic control were speaking to the helicopter pilot that he could see the passenger jet and was told to pass behind the plane shortly before the collision. President Trump asked for a moment's silence for what he called a tragedy of terrible proportions, before quickly blaming equal opportunity policies at air traffic control for making flying less safe.
The initiative is part of the FAA's diversity and inclusion hiring plan. Think of that. The initiative is part of the FAA's diversity and inclusion hiring plan, which says diversity is integral to achieving FAA's mission of ensuring safe and efficient travel. I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite.
how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay?
And it is just common sense, apparently. No evidence has been presented to connect diversity policies with this or any air accident. But Donald Trump has instantly turned a tragedy into yet another battleground in his culture war against what he calls the wokeism that he says has infected American public life. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Washington.
Now, eyewitnesses say everything about the plane's approach to the airport looked normal. So just what do we know about how the events leading up to this crash unfolded? Nick Eardley from BBC Verify has been taking a look.
These are the moments before a military helicopter collided with an American Airlines plane. This live feed from the Kennedy Center shows the skyline of Washington, D.C. On the right is the passenger plane, finishing a 2-hour flight from Kansas. On board, 64 people, including figure skaters returning from a competition. On the left, the military helicopter with 3 people on board. And here, another passenger plane. It's very common for planes and helicopters to share airspace in DC. In fact, US Transport Secretary Sean Duffy said nothing out of the ordinary happened in the run-up to the crash. But there were at least 2 near misses at the airport last year alone. Watch as both aircraft move closer together over about a minute. This is their flight path according to the tracking website ADS-B Exchange. The helicopter coming from the top in red, the plane arriving from the bottom in blue. It's 8:47 p.m. local time, around 25 seconds before impact. We also have air traffic control audio, which has been published online. As the 2 aircraft get closer, we can hear a conversation. This appears to be the air traffic controller flagging the presence of the plane. The helicopter is referred to PAT-25, the plane is CRJ.
CRJ in flight.
This response appears to be from the helicopter acknowledging the plane is there.
Aircraft in flight, press separation.
There's a second recording from Air Control 2. The audio is less clear, but it sounds like the helicopter is told to pass behind the plane.
This could have been a situational awareness issue, and the pilots of the Black Hawk just may not have seen because the aircraft was coming into their peripheral vision, and they've mistaken who that they are reporting to ATC that they have visual clearance of.
But the plane and the helicopter get closer to each other, and then this happens. Back to the flight radar. You can see the plane and helicopter getting close to each other. The passenger plane is on a steady descent for landing. One tracking site, ADS-B Exchange, records the helicopter gaining, then losing altitude. And this is the aftermath. The plane and its 60 passengers have crashed into the freezing Potomac River.
Well, the American Airlines plane had 64 passengers and crew on board when it collided with that military helicopter, which had 3 soldiers on board. And at least 15 people on the airplane were family members, athletes and coaches involved in US figure skating.